Good afternoon and welcome to the City Club of Cleveland. I'm Dan Moulthrop, Chief Executive here and also a proud member. It's my pleasure to introduce to you our speaker today, historian, attorney, and author of January 1973, Watergate, Roe v. Wade, Vietnam, and the Month That Changed America Forever, Jim Robenalt. Roe v. Wade was decided in January 1973. It was one of a series of events that left a monumental impact on American society. In that same month, President Lyndon Baines Johnson died. The U.S. ended its involvement in Vietnam. Watergate burglars went on trial. It marked, some say, the end of the Great Society era and laid a foundation for the Reagan Revolution. I don't mean to steal any of your thunder, but you'll probably, was that your first paragraph? Yeah, it was? Oh, sorry. Jim's awesome. I'm going to throw this out. Yeah. Jim's kind of amazing. I first met Jim and interacted with Jim when his previous book on the Harding Affair came out, and I interviewed him and was deeply, deeply impressed with the depth of his work, which would be uncommon for any historian, much less one who also had a full-time job at a certain law firm. It's been a pleasure watching Jim's career as a writer, this sort of side career he has, take off. Jim is also, as I said, a partner at Thompson Hine. He's in the business litigation practice group. He also, actually the first time that I met Jim Robenalt was when you guys were launching the Judicial Candidates, or JCRC, right. Judicial Candidates Ratings Coalition, also known as JudgeForYourself.com. Right. And Jim has also been consistently listed in the best lawyers in America and has been selected for inclusion in Ohio Super Lawyers, which I'm told comes with a cool t-shirt. The January 1973 book comes out of his education work with former White House counsel John Dean, who served in the Nixon administration. Mr. Robenalt is graduated a member of Phi Beta Kappa with a BA from Miami and from The Ohio State University's Michael E. Moritz College of Law as a member of the Order of the Coif. Ladies and gentlemen, Coif. I don't know these things. It does. Yeah. Yes, indeed. I don't know these things. Ladies and gentlemen, members and friends of the City Club of Cleveland, please join me in welcoming Jim Robenalt.
Okay. Thank you, Dan. Thank you. I don't know whether to thank him or not after that. But I've got a lot to get through. I wanted to tell you, first of all, I thank you all for coming today. It really means a lot. But this all comes out of what's called a continuing legal education program that I did, that I went to in 2010, so 5 years ago. It was all about Kent State and the shootings there, and they brought in one of the guys who was actually shot, some of the lawyers involved, and it was fascinating. I just thought, this is a really good program. And I had met John Dean through my work on the Warren Harding book. I called him afterwards, and I said, where were you that day? He actually was with J. Edgar Hoover that day. He had an interesting story about it. But he said, people ask me to do Watergate programs all the time, and I don't because nobody does a good job. How about you and I do one of these programs? And I said, sure, that sounds great, thinking we'd do one. That was in December of 2010. For the next 6 months, he sent me everything. He sent me the tapes to listen to, all sorts of things. So I had this tremendous source, and we did our first program in 2011. We have since then done about over 120 programs around the country. So I've gotten to know this story very well, and out of that work, I came across January 1973 because, to put you in the context, Watergate was June of 72. And so the burglars went on trial January of 73. That's one of the stories here. John Dean broke rank with Nixon in April of 73. So we walked through this month, and I said, John, look at all the things that are happening during this month. A whole bunch of stuff happening at once. And what I found out was that history is much like aspen trees. That's why I start with this thing. And my introduction says that that's because aspens grow in colonies from a single seedling that spreads through its roots. New stems, known as root suckers or ramets, pop up from the dirt at distance from the parent tree, creating a new tree and then another and then another. The entire clonal colony is interconnected below the surface through a single root system. The individual trees may come and go, but the root system remains, sometimes living for thousands of years. Studying American history is much like an examination of aspen trees. The connections are not obvious unless one digs. And then it becomes clear that everything is mysteriously linked. So what I found was that these stories, which I'm going to talk a little bit about, are linked mysteriously to me. And I still don't know precisely why, but it is fascinating to me. This picture tells you one of those linkages. In January of '73, Lyndon Johnson will die. The day that he dies, the Supreme Court decides Roe versus Wade. This picture was taken, obviously, on the day of the Kennedy assassination. And the woman who is swearing in LBJ, the only woman to ever swear in to this day, swear in a president, is a federal district court judge from Dallas who is named Sarah Hughes. And Johnson asked her to come. He would not leave before Jackie came and got on the plane with the casket. And that's Sarah Hughes delivering the oath of office. Several years after this photo was taken, Sarah Hughes was one of 3 judges on a 3-judge panel in Dallas who decided the case of Roe versus Wade. And her decision went straight to the Supreme Court. It didn't go through a court of appeals. So on the day that Johnson dies, her decision is affirmed by the Supreme Court. Just some amazing coincidences and linkages in this story. So that's a part of it. Let me walk you through the great events of January '73 to tell you why I think this is such a significant turning point in our politics. First of all, Harry Truman dies, so kind of the symbolic death of the New Deal. It's the end of the Vietnam War for the United States. The war will go on and then end tragically in '75 for the South Vietnamese, but we got out in January of '73. A lot of people of draft age back at that time here remember that month very well for that reason. But that story is told in this book. The Watergate burglars, as I said, went on trial. This is Judge Sirica, who, I'm not going to talk about this trial, but he became much more a prosecutor than a judge in that case. It's an interesting story that's never been told. Then Nixon delivers this game-changing second inaugural. I'm going to talk a little bit about that because we are living today in what I would call the Nixon Counter-Revolution. Most people think of it as the Reagan Revolution, but it's really the Nixon Counter-Revolution. It starts on this day in January of 1973. Then, of course, on 2 days later, Roe v. Wade is decided, and then that afternoon, Lyndon Johnson drops dead, kind of the symbolic end of the war on poverty and the New Deal. So it's one of history's great turning points, it turns out. There's all this simultaneity in history, high contingency moments. I talk about how there are times in our history when we really turn corners and things could go one way or the other. A book that I loved that is kind of my model is called April 1865, about the end of the Civil War. And the author there argues that we could have gone into 50 years of guerrilla war. Why did it go the way it did? It also is really kind of the stopping point of the New Deal, Great Society. Civil rights stalls at this point. The Nixon Counter-Revolution comes about, becomes the Reagan Revolution. And what Roe v. Wade does, and I'll talk about that today, is it supercharges this confrontational politics that Nixon starts. And people go to their corners. And what happens is this whole concept that we're living with today, no compromise in our federal government as a political weapon, enters our national politics because of Roe v. Wade. If I ask all of you to raise your hand who feels strongly about, and I'm not going to do it, who feels strongly about abortion, all of you would raise your hands. And then I would say, would you be willing to compromise your position? Very few of you would. So this whole idea of no compromise in our federal government really comes out of this month in Roe, and so it's important to talk about Roe. Let me give you some context here about this change that we went through during this period. That is a map of the presidential election of '64. Remember, Kennedy had been assassinated, Johnson becomes president, but he passes the Civil Rights Act. You'll notice the few states that were not blue in this are really, that's the beginning of what you would say the going against and the counter-revolution to the civil rights movement in the South. That's one of the greatest landslides in American history. The only one that was greater was FDR in '36. So look at this. This is 4 years later. And this is the Vietnam War. This is the civil rights movement, causing a lot of people to feel there's too much chaos. Things are too chaotic. Change is happening too fast. But if you notice, when Nixon wins, George Wallace ran as a third-party guy. He took the South. But you see just this dramatic change, and then look at it just 4 years later in 72. It's all red. This is Nixon against McGovern. And you see that Nixon has taken the South. This is the beginning of the Great Transformation. Prior to these years, the Democratic Party consisted of the Southerners, who were very loyal Democrats, Catholics, Unionists, and those people are all the people that Nixon will very cleverly move from the Democratic Party over to the Republican Party that we have today. But that's about as dramatic change as you're going to see in 8 years. Those maps show you that. As I say, it is really this backlash to the late 1960s. That's a picture from Kent State. Nixon, the day after he wins, on a taped conversation says, these are the 4 issues that allowed him to win: busing, amnesty, acid, and welfare. Busing, of course, is code for civil rights. Amnesty is about patriotism and young kids protesting the war. Acid is the sexual revolution and the drug revolution, and welfare is another code for civil rights and also for smaller government. So this party realignment happens during this period. It really takes its mark from January of 73. It will be, but look at this. I say party realignment, polarization based on social issues. Prior to this time, federal government was mostly about economy, jobs, and so forth. From this point forward, we start arguing social issues on a federal level. Abortion is one of them. Gay rights is another. And it really builds a new governing coalition against liberalism. This is a great picture because this is January 1, 1973, the first day. Do you know who that guy is with Ronald Reagan? That is the Ohio's governor, Jack Gilligan. Ohio State was playing USC that day, so great photograph for the beginning of that month. So this is Nixon's second inaugural that he delivers. And look at this line. Tell me if this echoes anything for you. In our lives, let each of us ask, not just what government can do for me, but what can I do for myself? It's a takeoff on JFK's ask not what your government can do for you, ask what you can do for your government. So if you look at this, the change is, this is looking out for myself, self-reliance, the me generation. This is the beginning of all of that change from that point in time. So what I really want to talk about today is Roe v. Wade and how it was decided, and focus on that part of this story. That's the court that decided. This is my inside source. This guy's name is Larry Hammond. He was a law clerk on the court at the time for Justice Powell. I'm the first person and the only person he's talked to about how this case was really decided in the Supreme Court. He got on the court in a kind of a quirky way. Justice Hugo Black hired him. He hired him because Larry stuttered. And Black was interested in helping his law clerks in some way, shape, or form. And when he found out that he had a stuttering problem, he hired him. A month later, Black dies. So it's this serendipity that this guy gets on the court, and he will play this critical role in Roe versus Wade. He dies a month later, so he should have been out. Larry Hammond should not have stayed on the court more than just one term. But Nixon selects Powell, who's in this photograph, along with Bill Rehnquist, at the same time to go on the court. And Powell decides to keep Hammond. A second kind of serendipitous moment for what's going to happen, as you'll see. First oral argument is in December of 71. Powell and Rehnquist are not yet on the court, so they don't sit with the court for that oral argument. There are only 7 justices sitting for it. This is the woman who argued Roe versus Wade. Her name is Sarah Weddington. She is 26 years old. It's her first argument in a court, let alone, any other court. And this is a picture. It's her husband next to her, her congressman, and her mother on that day that she argues the first oral argument. She also went to the University of Texas, where Larry Hammond had gone to school. They knew each other. Another interesting fact behind all this. So here's your court that would have listened to that argument. It doesn't include yet Powell and Rehnquist. And so you've got Marshall, you've got Blackmun, you've got Potter Stewart, William O. Douglas, Berger, Brennan, and who's on the end there? Whizzer White, who was put on by Kennedy. So they're going to decide this court. It is given to Blackmun by the Chief Justice to come up with an opinion. It was given to him because he was general counsel of the Mayo Clinic for about 10 years up in Minnesota. And so the chief wanted somebody who was schooled in medicine to come up with a decision. Well, Blackmun does come up with a decision, but he becomes kind of transfixed by the trimesters in a pregnancy, the 3 different stages of the pregnancy. In his first draft, he issues in June of '72. Now, this draft says the pregnant woman cannot be isolated in her privacy. And then he says this: the heart of the matter is that somewhere, either forthwith at conception, or at quickening, movement, or at birth, or at some other point in between, another being becomes involved. So in Roe, you are balancing 2 different questions, the woman's right versus the fetus's right. But he says this, and this is critical to understanding what happened in Roe. He says it's not for us of the judiciary, especially at this point in the development of man's knowledge, to speculate or specify when life begins. In other words, there is going to be a right to abortion, but the court's not going to draw a line. It's not going to say when a state can regulate it. That's how that decision came down. And if you look at this court, of the people who were on that court, the justices that I've circled here all voted in favor of that. And we would have a very different result in Roe. It would have left it to the states to decide when an abortion could be legal or not, and further cases would have come up as a result of that. But that didn't happen. It didn't happen because, and this is Justice William O. Douglas wrote a dissent that people don't know about that said these decisions should come down. They should have been announced. Burger, though, was not happy with the result, so he asked for a re-argument. Why? Because he knew that Rehnquist and Powell were going to join if they did re-argument. And he thought that these 2 conservatives would backtrack on even the right to an abortion. So they now are going to be involved in this re-argument of the case, and at least Burger's hoping that it will go the other way. Powell, as I said, hires this guy, Larry Hammond, and he sends Hammond off that summer of '72 to study up on these amicus briefs, principally, that had been put forward. And remember, Roe, there was no trial, nobody was a witness, there were no experts, there were no doctors. It was all done on paper, 2-hour oral argument. And so they had mostly amicus brief. Hammond went and looked at that. He gave to Powell a memo that said, I think there should be a right, and I think that is there a compelling interest in protecting fetal life? And he didn't know where to draw the line. They were kind of thinking about it, but he had come across a case that said viability is when you should draw that line. So we have the second oral argument. Again, Sarah Weddington comes and argues, and Blackmun's second draft does draw a line for the first time. He says that the state cannot regulate a woman's right to abort prior to the first trimester. Afterwards, the state can regulate it. That's the way Blackmun drafted it. This is where Larry Hammond gets involved. He tells Powell, you should move it to viability. So he argues, and Blackmun agrees, in the third draft to move it from the first trimester out to the second trimester, which is at the end of 6 months. And what that means is the state cannot prevent an abortion prior to 6 months if what they're trying to do is protect potential life or fetal life. They can only do it after the second trimester. Prior to that time, they can only regulate an abortion based on a woman's health in the second trimester, and prior to the first trimester, zero regulation. It's a decision between a doctor and a woman. This decision and how this came out this way is what caused the firestorm, because it's taking the right deep into abortion, or deep into the pregnancy, into a 6 months situation. But it's also a situation where people felt that this is a decision that should be decided state by state, and so this movement gets its wings at this point, especially the far right. Sarah Weddington gets the announcement on January 22 from the Supreme Court that the judgment has been affirmed. She looks at it and she says, I wonder where this came from. because nobody argued viability. This was totally done within the court, and it really was Larry Hammond convincing Powell to get there. Now, why did Hammond do that? Why did he say viability? He did it for good reasons. He said, if we have a right that is gone after the first 3 months, then some of the women who need abortion services the most, the young, the inexperienced, women who are not willing to tell their husbands or their parents, are going to be past that 3 months before they actually potentially recognize the situation. And he said they would be denied that right. So he takes it all the way out to the end of the 6th month. And that is what, as I say, causes the firestorm. Later that day, of course, LBJ dies. But this gives rise to the religious right in national politics. Now, abortion is not their issue right away. It takes a couple years for this to happen, but it does become their issue. And we are still fighting this 40 years later, as you all know. And as I say, this no compromise idea becomes a political weapon that's used during this time. So we take this religious right group and we move them into what people are calling the Tea Party, or some people call them the Tea-vangelicals, and this whole idea of no compromise as a political strategy really comes out of all of this. And so we can see that connection there. Now, the question is, what's going to happen with this case that was just taken up by the Supreme Court last week of Texas? That case held that there could be regulation prior to the 6 months. For example, an abortion clinic would have to satisfy the requirements of an ambulatory care center. And doctors would have to have privileges in nearby hospitals. Those regulations, the Fifth Circuit said, were appropriate and okay as long as they didn't impose an undue burden. But the effect in Texas was that 40 centers were taken down to 7 as a result of that, the ambulatory care center requirements. So that's going up to the Supreme Court. The issue is, what's the Supreme Court going to do? So let me give you some clue on that, about whether they're going to actually attack this viability issue, which still remains the case. And let me start with Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who is one of the most liberal members of the court. She recently has been talking about how she thought Roe was problematic. And I'll read to you from one of her talks recently. Justice Ginsburg told an audience at the University of Chicago Law School that while she supports a woman's right to choose, she feels the ruling by her predecessors on the court was too sweeping and gave abortion opponents a symbol to target. Ever since, she said, the momentum has been on the other side, with anger over Roe fueling a state-by-state campaign that has placed more restrictions on abortions. 4 decades later, abortion is one of the most polarizing issues in American life. She says a more restrained judgment would have sent a message while allowing momentum to build at a time when a number of states were expanding abortion rights. In other words, New York, for example, had recognized the right to an abortion, and had the court not stepped in and just said, we're not going to allow you to regulate it prior to 6 months, it would have worked through the system and found perhaps more acceptance than we have now. On the other side, this is what Scalia says. So you've got Ginsburg on the court saying that. Scalia says this: the court's description of the place of Roe in social history of the United States is unrecognizable. Not only did Roe not, as the court suggests, resolve the deeply divisive issue of abortion, it did more than anything else to nourish it by elevating it to a national level where it is infinitely more difficult to resolve. National politics were not plagued by abortion protests, national abortion lobbying, or abortion marches on Congress before Roe v. Wade was decided. Profound disagreement existed among our citizens over this issue, as it does over other issues such as the death penalty, but that disagreement was being worked out at the state level. As with many other issues, the division of sentiment within each state was not as closely balanced as it was among the population of the nation as a whole, meaning not only that more people would be satisfied with the results of a state-by-state resolution, but also that those results would be more stable. Pre-Roe, moreover, political compromise was possible. So the people on the Supreme Court thought they were, Larry Hammond told me this, they thought they were ending this issue forever, but the way they decided it caused this firestorm, and we're still dealing with it. The question is whether or not the court will directly go after the viability standard or not in this decision. And I've given you 2 comments by justices who are on the polar opposites of this whole issue. So it's going to be interesting to see what happens. I will say this, that if we look at this question of the evangelicals turning into T-evangelicals, it is the case that most Tea Party members are a part of the evangelical movement, and that one of their core issues is abortion. So this whole idea of the idea that you're not going to compromise with opponents, your political strategy is going to be, we're going to shut down the government before we compromise on this, is what we're living with today. Because we just saw it happen. The Planned Parenthood videos ended up resulting in people saying we're going to shut down the government over this issue unless we defund Planned Parenthood. So it's an amazingly complicated and serious issue, and one that people have different views about. But I think that the important thing to do is to go back and understand how we got to where we were, to understand what has happened today. So I don't take a position when I talk about this one way or the other because it is so controversial. But I do think that most people do not know the real story behind Roe, and it's important to understand that as we get into a national debate on the issue, which I think is obviously going to continue for some period of time, and it'll be interesting to see what the Supreme Court does with all this. So those are my remarks.
You did it in under 30 minutes.
In under 30 minutes.
Well done.
Okay.
You can sit for a second. Today we are enjoying a forum featuring James D. Robenalt, historian, attorney, and author of January 1973, Watergate, Roe v. Wade, Vietnam, and the Month That Changed America Forever. We encourage you to organize your questions for our speaker now, and remind you that your questions should be brief and to the point. If you're joining us via our webcast and would like to tweet a question, please tweet it at the City Club. We welcome all of you here and those joining us via Twitter and via our web stream, provided by our primary media partner, 90.3 WCPN, WVIZ PBS, 104.9 WCLV Idea Stream, or one of the many other radio stations across the region and country that carry City Club programs. Production, distribution, and broadcast of the City Club is made possible by Cleveland State University and PNC. Be sure to join us this Friday, November 20th at noon at Case Western Reserve University. We're taking the Friday Forum on the road to participate in the TEDx Clee Salon event celebrating the 100th anniversary of Einstein's theory of general relativity. For more information about that program or any of our upcoming and past forums, please visit us online at cityclub.org. Today's forum is sponsored by Thompson Hine. We thank you very much for your support. Also, we welcome students today to today's forum from St. Edward's High School. Student participation is made possible by the Mary Jane Spar and Charles E. Spar Charitable Trust. Would the students please stand to be recognized? And now it is time to return to our speaker for the traditional City Club Q&A. We welcome questions from everyone, including guests. Holding our microphones today are Content Associate Teddy Eisenberg and Director of Programming Stephanie Jansky. Do we have our first question?
Yes, sir. I was just wondering, I do believe we had a more sympathetic attitude towards immigrants at that time, didn't we? Because the farm workers were just starting, and Cesar Chavez was more of a folk hero, right?
I'm not sure. But, the question of immigration, is that what you're asking me about? It really isn't a topic in this book. But, I think that immigration in the United States, I know from writing about Warren Harding and, for the last 100 years, has gone through these periods where we become more xenophobic and more concerned about it than other times for all sorts of reasons. And, I think that in the 1970s, oddly enough, Richard Nixon was much more liberal about some things. But frankly, I don't know his stance on immigration at the time. It could have been up or down, I just don't know. But we definitely have gone through cycles on it.
I would like to make a comment about Jim, and so I know him slightly, but I know that he's a wonderful researcher, and he is amazing of the information he finds. I've talked to him about this book over the years. But what I wanted to know is I didn't realize that a woman has a right to an abortion up to the through the second trimester?
Yeah.
Well, surely the viability of a fetus has changed over that. That has to be taken into account, does it not?
Yeah, no, that is actually, it was actually one of the debates within the court of going to the viability standard, that standard is going to change. As we get better at medicine, it moves, it's a moving target, so it's difficult to figure out. The way they got there was interesting. The way they got there was Larry Hammond had read a case out of Connecticut called Abilene. And in that case, Connecticut had said no abortions. That was ruled unconstitutional. And so the state legislature went back and crafted something that said, we are doing this on behalf of the life of the fetus from conception forward. And the district court that decided that case that Hammond then read said, well, that's unconstitutional too. And to try to give some direction to the state legislature, they said, this is all dicta, by the way, what we call dicta as lawyers, not necessary for it. But they looked at it and they said, well, you've got two interests here. You've got the woman's right to an abortion, and you've got the fetal right to life. And so they say, well, when would that fetal right to life become compelling such that a state could deny the right to an abortion, which is a fundamental right for a woman under the right of privacy of the Constitution? And they said, the way we will draw that line is nobody knows when life begins. This is like belief in God. Nobody knows for sure. People have different opinions about it. We live in a pluralistic society. Some people say it's at conception, some people say it's at birth, and some people say in between. But we can't say for sure. But one thing we can say for sure is that if a fetus is born alive, everyone would agree you would not kill that fetus. That's how you get to viability. That case says, if you're going to draw a line, legislature, draw it there, because everyone will agree on it, and that makes it a compelling interest. And Larry read that opinion, gave it to Justice Powell, and this is interesting. You can find these papers online, Powell's papers, and he gives them a memo with it and says, I think this is a good case to use. That was right, and Powell reads it like the day before that second oral argument. And Powell then gets on the bench, listens to all the argument. Nobody even mentions the word viability. It is not argued. Nobody proposes it. Powell doesn't say anything about it. And instead, they go back and they work behind closed doors to come up with where we're going to draw the line. And as I said, the first line that was drawn by Blackmun was only after first 3 months. That was the first line. And it was only Larry Hammond interjecting with Powell who went to Blackmun to change that standard. And that, it's a little known story. People think of Blackmun being the author of Roe v. Wade. It was really Powell, because this issue of viability is the only thing that stands from the trimester. The rest of it was gotten rid of in '92 in a case called Casey that got rid of the rest of the structure, but it kept viability. So if you look at this Texas case that's coming down, or that came down, they don't attack viability in that case. They say, pre-viability, can we nevertheless do regulation about how an abortion is done, where it's done, by whom it's done? And that's what's going to be in the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court could just answer those questions and stick with that case and not make, still make some law. But they could go after the viability standard too. That's what I think people are concerned about and surprised that they took this case. But if you read enough about how these justices feel about Roe and how it was decided, they're troubled by it. When you got Ginsburg and Scalia agreeing on the same thing, it's unusual. But it wouldn't surprise me if they did go to the viability standard and say, let's let the states decide this issue. On the other hand, they could just stick to the case and say, you could still have some regulation that would be appropriate. Or they could overturn the Fifth Circuit and say, this regulation is improper because it really does cause an undue burden on a constitutional right of a woman to have an abortion. Particularly the 40, units down to 7. Some of these women have to travel 250 miles to the nearest abortion center. So it's fascinating, and I think it's one of those issues that, because of the way it was decided, sparked something they didn't mean to spark. They thought they were ending it. They thought they were finishing the discussion and providing guidance to everybody that everybody would follow. And instead, it caused the firestorm that lives today. So that moving target of when is viability is one of the issues people argue about all the time. And I owe you $20 for saying something nice about me.
Jim, thank you for taking the time to put on what was a very wonderful presentation. It seems that many times a person's religious beliefs will tend to weigh in on their beliefs on the abortion issue, and I think in one of the slides you showed, in fact, it referenced, one of the protests referenced God. Did your source have anything to say about what role religion may have played in the court's behind-the-scenes debates in Roe versus Wade?
Yeah, very interesting question. Larry Hammond, his father was a Methodist minister in Texas. And so was Sarah Weddington. Her father was also, she came from a strong Methodist Protestant background. And at the time, the justices were mainly Protestants. Interesting, today, they're mainly Catholic by some quirk. But back then, Powell, for example, and Blackmun, those guys were Protestants, and they didn't feel as strongly about it as the Catholics of the day. So that, for example, when Roe came out, the headline is LBJ dies, Kissinger's in Vietnam or in Paris to end the Vietnam War, and then a smaller, very little thing about Roe v. Wade decided, abortion legalized. The only group that reacted to Roe originally was the Catholic Church. Felt very strongly about it. If you go back and look at polls at the time, most Protestants thought it was a good opinion, supported it, felt okay about it. And it really took a number of years for it to take hold, where the evangelical slice of Protestantism really used this issue to galvanize people to get politically active. They started with the Bob Jones decision about racial segregation in college institutions, decided that wasn't a good issue to rally around. And then they eventually came to abortion, and they used that issue to galvanize people in the pulpit to become more politically active and so forth. So it kind of morphed into that. But it's very interesting. On the day Roe was decided, most Protestants, including those who would become evangelicals, supported it. And so what Larry said to me was, you know, we thought we were ending it for good. We thought we came up with a proper decision. But he knew he was in trouble a couple years later when he went to Notre Dame to speak about it. Somebody asked him to come and speak. And his opponent was a young guy who was not on the Supreme Court named Scalia. And they debated each other on it. And he said, I decided, Jim, after that, I ought to go into other fields to do my work. And so he kind of faded into history, went out to Arizona, where he has a law firm out there that has several Supreme Court clerks from the time. And to this day is just a wonderful guy. He, for example, does the Innocence Project, which is DNA to get people out of prison and so forth. He does a lot of work on that front. But he wrote me a letter after I wrote this book. You know, he talked with me multiple times. And I'll tell you why he talked with me. It's an interesting story. But he wrote me a letter that said, you did a fabulous job with this. And I've given it to some of my colleagues who are on the Supreme Court, and it's great. But I really worried about what you were going to do and what you were going to say. So he's lived kind of this in obscurity, not really raising his hand. The reason he talked with me was, and this is the strange interconnectedness of these stories. When John Dean and I went to Arizona to do a Watergate ethics program for lawyers, he's a lawyer, so he came to get his CLE. And I met him there. And so why was he interested in Watergate? Because when he left the Supreme Court, he went to the Watergate Special Prosecution Force that was then, investigating Richard Nixon. So again, these odd connections. And so I talked with him and said that I was writing this book, and would he talk with me? And he said, yeah. And I said, he had talked with other people before Powell's papers came out and really had not said much. But Powell said before he died, you are free to talk about anything you did with me. Don't talk about any other justices or your views of them or what they did, just me. So he was very careful. He didn't tell me his opinion about Blackmun or any of the rest of that stuff, but he did say that Powell wanted him to be able to talk about this, and I was the first person to really sit down and talk with him about it. And once I got into it, I thought, oh my goodness, this is an amazing story from this guy. But anyway, to go back to your question, it evolved. And by the time we get to Reagan, it's a central part of the Republican Party, and abortion becomes a huge issue. You're not old enough to remember, every one of the Supreme Court candidates, the litmus test was abortion. How do you feel about it? You know, what do you think about it, and so forth. So it's, and it's interesting because the guys who got on the court, both Powell and Rehnquist, and I point this out in here, were chosen within like 24 hours. Nixon's first nominees had been shot down by the Senate, and he was furious about it. It was the second time it had happened to him. And within 24 hours, he nominates Rehnquist, who will be so important to the court, and Powell. Nobody was thinking about Rehnquist 24 hours earlier. It's just amazing. This, you know, the way things happen in all of this and how it all gets put together is an amazing story. So, you know, nobody vetted those guys about their views on anything, let alone how did they feel about abortion and what they would do about it. Incredible story.
Jim, I have this feeling that I'm part of this great country because we have this thing called the Constitution, which embodies this notion of state rights. And I struggle with, you know, how can you take a concept like gay marriage or abortion and, you know, why isn't that, you know, how can that be different in one state versus another?
Right.
Can you give me a 30-second education in why state rights are important and how that helps us as a country and whether these issues should involve some element of state rights?
Yeah, I mean, the exact same issue that was argued about abortion, whether this should be left to the state-by-state decision or the federal government, was argued in Roe, was also argued in the same-sex marriage cases that we just saw come down. And they're principally based on the 14th Amendment, which was that post-Civil War amendment that said no one shall be denied due process, you know, no denial of your right of liberty, life, liberty, or property without due process. Liberty is the key term that they read everything into. So they say there is a liberty right that is established through the 14th Amendment, and one of those rights is a right to privacy. And that came out of a case called Griswold that Justice Douglas decided. That case was all about somebody getting contraception devices. And Douglas just said there is a right of privacy, even though it doesn't say it in the Constitution, from all these what he called penumbral rights, which are like the government can't come in and invade your home, no search and seizure, you know, right to speech, all these sorts of things are, he said, creates a right of privacy that equally applies eventually to abortion, the private decision about family matters. So what they say, the Supreme Court, is the states can't regulate something that is a core, fundamental constitutional right. They cannot regulate in that area. That's what Roe decided. And eventually that's the same-sex marriage case too, deciding that issue. But you know, the abortion issue is different from same-sex marriage, where you have two competing interests in an abortion, vying for, you know, who's going to agree on the right of the fetus versus the right of the woman. That's where the nub comes in, and that's where it becomes, you know, much more complicated than same-sex marriage, for example. But what they're saying is, and what these cases say is, the Constitution will trump any state's regulation when it comes to a fundamental right like free speech or this right of privacy. And that right of privacy is another hot point for people, because if you look at people who argue against Roe, they start with, there's no right of privacy in the Constitution. It doesn't say anything about that. You know, you're making it up. And that's what makes it so difficult and so hard to decide what to think or do in these cases. But there's a whole school of people who say this issue would have been better off left to the states to work out. They may have eventually drawn a line in the Supreme Court, but it would have been after a lot of legislative process. The thing about Roe that was so peculiar was that Sarah Hughes, the judge who I showed you, who sat on this 3-judge panel, they had the woman who was Roe put in an affidavit, and they had, I think, a doctor put in an affidavit, And they argued it from that. There was no trial. There was nobody testifying. There was nobody cross-examined. That's the record that went to the Supreme Court. And that's the record that decided this right. And that's why everybody was so perplexed when it came out that they were deciding viability, because nobody had argued viability. You know, where did that come from? Well, it came from Larry Hammond, who thought that one case was good, gave it to Powell, and Powell then convinced the others about it. So this whole school of thought of this was what, as Ruth Bader Ginsburg said, this was too sweeping, and it caused this reaction in the states. And I argued the overall case that it also accelerated this polarization that Nixon, you know, people on the right move further right, people on the left move further left. People can't talk about this issue. I wrote an article about that recently, that people just won't talk about this issue. We don't debate it. We don't really talk about when we think life begins. Some people have this view, some people have that view, and they shout at each other. And I think it is a very appropriate topic for people to talk about. So. Especially at a place like this at the City Club, where we have free speech to talk about all this stuff. So thanks for the question.
Jim, in 1973, did anyone on the court have any idea about how big or divisive this would be going forward? And then after the fact, did anyone have second thoughts about the opinion among the Supreme Court?
Great question, Richard. You know, the court had some inkling that it was going to be a big decision. That day, Blackmun, for example, invited his spouse to come down and sit there, and there's a very famous note that Powell wrote to her and had taken down to her in the audience, that, you know, I'm very proud of your husband today and what he's doing. So they knew it was a big deal, and Blackmun actually composed a press release that was like 3 or 4 pages long to describe the opinion, because he was worried about the reaction to it all. And the court eventually said, no, we read our opinions, we don't read press releases. So you can go see his press release in the Supreme Court, in his papers, the Blackmun papers. But I think that they thought it would be stormy for a little bit. They had no idea that it was going to spark this huge, you know, movement of people getting politically active as a result of religious beliefs. And it really does take us right to where we are today on all that. What Larry Hammond said to me, I asked him, I said, do you have any regrets about it? And he said, no, I don't. He said he thought it was the right choice then. He still thinks it is now. He feels very strongly about it. Blackmun, you know, was over time, people would protest him when he was anywhere, and little did they know it was really Powell they needed to protest. But, you know, and Blackmun moved further and further left as a result of all of this. He was Warren Burger's best friend growing up. The two of them were in Minneapolis. They called him the Minneapolis Twins. He was best man at Burger's wedding. So they knew each other. The reason he got on the court is that Nixon was having a real problem with the Senate. And this is a long story that I explore in here, but they had rejected somebody, 2 Southerners, to take the Abe Fortas seat. This was retaliation by the Democrats. They rejected 2 Southern. Hainsworth was one, Carswell. And so Nixon storms in to a press conference and says, well, the Senate's not going to approve somebody from the South. I guess I'll pick somebody from the North. That night, and you got the telephone calls, he calls Burger, and Burger says, well, why don't you pick Blackmun? And within 24 hours, Blackmun is in the Oval Office. Nixon spends 35 minutes with him, and he becomes a justice of the Supreme Court of the United States. That's all the vetting that was done. But Blackmun and Burger would eventually break as a result of this. They would have this really, especially over the abortion issue. Burger voted for Roe and then regretted it and went backwards. And the two of them wouldn't even talk to each other by the time it was all over. So it ended up being a much bigger issue than they really perceived at the time. They perceived that it was going to be mainly accepted, which it was. They had no idea it would spark this counter-revolution. So, good question.
You make a very compelling argument about Roe v. Wade being very predictive of how politics changed between the time that LBJ had the landslide victory and the country was blue and now it's red. Right. Ian Haney Lopez has written this book, Dog Whistle Politics, which argues that racism explains the shift of the country from from blue to red, and in particular focuses on those 4 states, those 4 deep southern states that Goldwater won, were very, very committed Democratic states. They loved the Democratic Party, and for those states to switch, that was the start of that racism became this predictor of people's of the shift in politics from the war on poverty in a sense to to what we have today. So can you comment on racism versus, say, something as deep-seated as Roe v. Wade, and kind of compare their impacts on the shift in our political
Yeah, great
system?
question. I've actually had this argument with Linda Greenhouse, who is Blackmun's biographer, New York Times writer, now a Yale professor, and she wrote an article a couple years ago that said it wasn't Roe v. Wade that caused this, it was the Nixon Counter-Revolution. And in particular, racism and changing the South from Democrat to Republican over the concern of the civil rights movement and all of that change that was happening. And we went back and forth on this because I said, I agree with you. And that's why I start my talk with, this is the Nixon Counter-Revolution, that's the start of it. But I think that it was supercharged by Roe v. Wade. And I think that Roe did have an impact on solidifying people on the ends about this. But I couldn't agree with you more that the beginning of it is 2 things. The concern about the civil rights movement, and particularly among the South. And the South was traditionally Democratic and Jim Crow and all the rest of that stuff. But Kennedy depended on them, FDR depended on them to become president, and they kind of looked the other way on the race issue. Johnson was the first one of all people coming from the South who changed it. And so I spent a lot of time on Johnson in here. He is a devil in the sense that he got us into Vietnam, and it caused further chaos in all of this. But he's also, to me, a hero in what he did on civil rights. And so I describe in here his last month. And there's a great call between he and Nixon that's on tape. That I talk about in here. But what I show is that in December of 72, he convened a civil rights group down in Austin for his library because they were releasing his papers on civil rights. He went there. It's a great thing. Look it up on YouTube. In the middle of the talk, he gets up there and he grabs into his pocket and puts a nitroglycerin tablet in his mouth because he's having such heart pains, severe. He was only 64 years old when he died. And so he convenes everybody, including Hubert Humphrey and all the civil rights leaders, and it's a wonderful talk. If you want to go look at a really great talk by an ex-president, to me that's one of the top. And then on January 12th, Walter Cronkite sits down with him to talk about his legacy in civil rights. It's another great little piece about what he thought he was doing. He said that was the most important thing he did in his presidency. And that caused this counter-reaction that Nixon took advantage of, and in particular in the South, just this, we're moving too fast, it's too much chaos, and this country has always had a very horrific racist streak in it, and it continues to have that. So that's part of the story that I tell in here, is that that's the legacy of Lyndon Johnson to me, and it's significant that this all comes together in this month when everything is turning point. So good observation, and I agree with you.
Jim, your book, January 1973, is really a remarkable and interesting read because it unfolds, to my surprise, like a great mystery. There's a whole bunch of different, seemingly unrelated plots that unfold that all start weaving together at strange points, and it's just a great read. And I wonder, before we leave, could you give the audience a sense of some of those seemingly unrelated issues that then intersect? Because you were focused today mostly on the abortion rights issue.
Right. I owe you $20. Let me give you one other example of this interconnectedness of these stories. One of the things I start with is what's called the Christmas bombing of 1972. So this is Vietnam. And after the election of 72, where Nixon won that landslide, he had a problem. And his problem was that while he won by a landslide against Mcgovern, mainly over Vietnam, and people not wanting to just bug out and leave Vietnam without peace with honor, that the Congress, though, remained Democratic. And in fact, the Democrats gained seats in the Senate, including one of them was a guy named Joe Biden, who was not yet 30 years old. So he had a problem because he knew that that Democratic Congress was going to shut down funding for Vietnam. People were sick of the war, and he had to end it. So after that time, his leverage actually went down, and the North Vietnamese knew it. And so they were negotiating with Henry Kissinger in Paris, and they started backtracking because they wanted Congress to defund the war, and they would then just take off from there. So it's a fascinating, how this all happens with Nixon. Now, what happens, though, is because he does then engage in this Christmas bombing, which is brutal, and it's all on tape. He and Kissinger and Haig deciding to do this. Go listen to that tape. It's fascinating why they did it. Kissinger literally says, we're going to bomb the bejesus out of them. What happens is we do that bombing. The world erupts, that we're doing it with B-52s, 6 miles high, dropping these huge bombs on Hanoi and Haiphong, and people think it's madness. And as a result of that, while it does push the war to its end, it unexpectedly sparks senators like Mike Mansfield and some senator from South Carolina named Sam Ervin to get upset about the imperial presidency and the overreach by the president. And so that bombing leads directly to the voting by the Senate to investigate Watergate. So that is the reason, because think about this, you guys. Nixon won by a landslide. Everybody knew about Watergate. I told you it happened in June of '72. And by November, nobody cared. Nobody cared about Watergate. It was really the Christmas bombing that sparked the Watergate Committee, which John Dean will then become the prime witness for. But it's, these things are all really amazingly connected. And I could go on and on with all these other connections, but that's a good one.
Jim, thanks for discussing this. It's obviously a timely issue. I was wondering, sort of prospectively, do you foresee the same sort of fallout from the gay marriage decisions that we saw for Roe, or do you think, sort of based on public opinion and the fact that it may be more difficult for a bloc to rally, in opposition to it, that we might not see the same sort of protracted battle? Obviously a short-term one, but maybe not 30, 40 years down the line.
Right. Great question. It's probably the last one here. I've written about this. I do not think that the same-sex marriage is going to spark the same level of problem that abortion did, because same-sex marriage, it's two people getting married, and there's not two conflicting interests. It's just some people don't like it, some people do. They eventually get used to it. I really think that's what's going to happen. Abortion's different because there are two interests involved. Some people feel that fetal life starts at conception, and that's the problem. That's why this thing continues to bedevil us. But I think same-sex marriage is going to be accepted. It will be used in this election to show that the Supreme Court overreached. But I just don't think you have those two different, uncompromisable positions on it. I think people just eventually they say, my neighbor's gay, so what? I really think that's what's going to happen. So, good question.
Well done, sir. It did. Awesome. Enjoy it. Sit it in. All right, ladies and gentlemen, the book is January 1973. The author is a great friend of the City Club's, Jim Robenalt. Thank you so much for being here. Our forum is adjourned.